Sophie Okonedo, 31st of December 1998. This was shot for Time Out, which published its last print edition just over 2 years ago. It lasted for more than half a century. Since the advertising revenue has gone to Google and Facebook, magazines like Time Out are not financially viable. The cash paid for the content, and we effectively in the digital age became content providers. As such, we kind of were prepared to work for less and less and less, and indirectly provided parachute payments for an industry in terminal decline. In 1998, when I arrived at the National Theatre for this assignment, my jobs were coming in thick and fast. These portraits were actually taken on New Year's Eve. She was in rehearsals for Troilus and Cressida, a breakthrough role that would be the start of a career that proved to be extremely glittering. As the contacts show, she was wonderfully photogenic and playful, and we obviously had a good rapport. I seem to remember we bonded over each having one Jewish parent. I found the perfect place to shoot. It was a thoroughfare, a passageway, which could cause problems, but it was lined with material on the walls that would make a great backdrop. The fabric also deadened the noise there, so it was quite an intimate space and a nice environment to do a portrait. I set up my ring flash. This isn't the actual ring flash I used back then. I had a huge Bowens number. It was massive, and it plugged into a big kind of electrical power unit with loads of buttons on it. It looked like something from the 60s. And in addition to that, I set up a redhead on a single stand, which I intended to use as a modeling light, but also as a light source in itself. It's interesting looking at this equipment now and pondering how things have changed. This stuff is nasty. The cameras were bigger, they didn't have autofocus, having to get the exposure just right, having to deal with film, load the camera, your sort of hands slightly shaking as you're loading the camera under pressure. And these lights, which are kind of really unpleasant to work with. This is a tungsten light source, so it gets really, really hot. And you've got these metal barn doors to shape the light, which also heat up. So not great to work with. I think because of the time of year, New Year's Eve, I was slightly in holiday mode. And I remember being quite relaxed. I mean, normally you'd tape down with gaffer tape all the cables and so on. But I just let this kind of spaghetti of electrical wires just mount up on the floor around the shoot. Looking at the contacts, you know, we were having fun. She was trying not to laugh. It was all joyful and whimsical, and then suddenly it wasn't. A stagehand or somebody out of my vision, because I had this extension lead, tripped over the cable. I never found out who did it. And suddenly, this horrible redhead that I just described on a stand sort of tipped and is heading towards her face. She puts her hand up to cover her face, and the barn doors, the horrible metally barn doors, gouge into her skin. Absolute nightmare. I mean, she let out a little shriek. It was so embarrassing. I mean, you don't know what to say. She was clearly shaken, and she should have stormed off or given me both barrels. But instead, and it's a mark of her sort of professionalism and sweetness, we carried on with the shoot. We left all the equipment there, and we went outside and took some pictures in the daylight against the brutalist architecture of the South Bank Centre. It's an area that I've exploited lots of times, and I'm sure other photographers must have done too. It works really well because it's neutral. And I remember one such occasion was earlier that year. I'd photographed, I don't know if he was a Sir back then, but Ian McKellen against that same wall. I think he was a Sir. Now, the age I was very young, and I am a very competitive person. I mean, you have to be in order to be successful. You're kind of competing against all the other photographers. And it sounds ludicrous, but I still kind of believe that my subject is standing in the way of me getting what I want. I'm not interested in becoming their friend or having a rapport only in as much as it enables me to get amazing pictures. I always sort of think about my work and getting a good result. And to that end, you know, I'm quite ashamed really that we carried on taking these pictures. After a while, you know, I came to my senses. I saw she had a little bead, a crimson bead of blood on her hand. And she looked quite vulnerable and, as I said, shaken. And so we drew the shoot to a close. All the pictures were taken on my Hasselblad on tungsten balanced transparency film, which we cross-processed, which produces nice contrasty negatives. Things could have been really bad if it hadn't been for her chilled attitude and kindness. As I said, I'd only been a photographer for 10 years and had yet to learn about the value of public liability insurance. I mean, that shoot could have been my last. You may not have heard of Sophie Okonedo. She's not someone, I think, who would regard herself as a celebrity or relish being on the red carpet. She's a quiet actor, polymorphous. She totally inhabits the characters that she portrays. According to director Michael Caton Jones, Harvey Weinstein sacked her from a movie that he was working on for not being F-wordable. It obviously didn't hold her back, because in the years that followed, a Tony, an Emmy, numerous BAFTAs, a Golden Globe, and in 2004, she was nominated for an Oscar for her part in Hotel Rwanda. It's always great to see good people do well.